as they unfold in the shooting down of a Korean jumbo jet off the coast of a Soviet military outpost. Among those killed when the plane came down was a Georgia Congressman, Larry McDonald. We'll find out what his wife has to say. She believes there was a conspiracy to kill her husband, and she is thinking now about trying to succeed him in Congress. We'll see what Kathy McDonald has to say about the death of her husband and find out what she wants this country to do about it. From Flushing Meadows, New York, we will see the results produced on day 3 at the U.S. Open tennis tournament. And also tonight we will have a report on the passing of Washington State Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. Newsnight is next. Hello, this is Newsnight on the Cable News Network. The ruling party in Israel picks a new leader. President Reagan sends more Marines to the waters off Lebanon, and a killer dies in the gas chamber.
We will update the Korean airliner story, but first,
as to how the flight got off course, why the Soviets blasted it out of the sky, and how the United States plans now to respond. President Reagan may answer some of those questions in just about 10 hours. He'll be addressing the nation just before noon Eastern Time. The Soviets may never reveal why they made the attack. Their answers so far have only angered the White House and the rest of the nation, which has labeled the incident as inexplicable, barbaric. The United Nations will look for some answers on Friday when the Security Council takes up the question. One thing is certain tonight. 269 people died when a civilian jet was attacked. Jim Clancy reports on that attack and on the search for bodies in the Sea of Japan.
Heavy fog hampered search efforts in the area of Sakhalin Island. There is almost no hope that any of the 269 people aboard Korean Airlines Flight 007 will be found alive. At least 30 Americans, including Congressman Larry McDonald of Georgia, were aboard the plane, which the State Department says was shot down by a missile fired from a Soviet Su-15 fighter. Because of the sophisticated navigational equipment aboard the Boeing 747, Korean airline officials say they do not believe it strayed off course. But at the State Department Thursday morning, Secretary George Shultz said, in fact, the unarmed aircraft had strayed over the Soviet island of Sakhalin.
The aircraft strayed into Soviet airspace over the Kamchatka Peninsula and over the Sea of Okhotsk and over the Sakhalin Islands. The Soviets tracked the commercial airliner for some 2.5 hours. A Soviet pilot reported visual contact with the aircraft at 1812 hours. The Soviet plane was, we know, in constant contact with its ground control. At 1821 hours, the Korean aircraft was reported by the Soviet pilot at 10,000 meters. At 1826 hours, the Soviet pilot reported that he fired a missile and the target was destroyed.
The flight path between Anchorage, Alaska and Seoul, Korea regularly takes commercial aircraft within 80 miles of Soviet airspace. Airspace considered sensitive because of military installations on the Kamchatka Peninsula. Secretary of State Shultz made it clear that intelligence sources were monitoring the conversations between the Soviet fighters and their ground controllers. But it remains unclear what happened during the period when Soviet fighters had visual contact with the jumbo jet. The official word from TASS received at the State Department said only that the Soviet fighter planes tried to assist the 747 to the nearest base. The message was the same from Radio Moscow.
The intruder plane did not react to the signals and warnings of the Soviet fighter plane and continued its flight towards the Sea of Japan.
Neither TASS nor Radio Moscow made any mention of shooting down the unarmed jet, but they did say its navigational lights appeared to be inoperative, perhaps signaling the jet was having electrical problems. Korean airline executives said any pilot with so many civilian passengers aboard would have certainly obeyed directions from fighter aircraft. Korea and the United States are still awaiting a satisfactory response from the Soviet Union as to why the passenger plane was destroyed in midair. Jim Clancy, CNN.
Reaction to the downing of the Korean jetliner was quick and it was stinging. In Washington, former President Jimmy Carter blasted the Soviet Union for the incident.
They attack by the Soviet Union against a defenseless and well-identified private commercial carrier loaded with civilian passengers is totally unwarranted. There is no possible legitimate excuse that the Soviet government could put forward for this despicable action. And I don't want to get in a role publicly of advising the President what action to take. But we should express in the clearest possible terms the abhorrence that we share with the rest of the world about this killing of innocent people.
On Capitol Hill, Georgia Congressman Newt Gingrich called the incident a premeditated attack by the Soviet Union.
Candidly, I think what happened is that somebody yesterday made a decision to shoot down an airplane, that they discovered after the plane was shot down that Congressman McDonald was on the plane, and that what was an act of beating up on a small country, South Korea, suddenly became a major international incident involving the death of an American congressman, and that they are now going to try to lie their way out of it. I think that they're sort of like a mugger who suddenly found they had jumped on a bigger victim than they thought.
Gingrich called for immediate action by the United States in response to the Soviet attack.
Stone. Here are this morning's top stories. Senator Henry Jackson, the Washington Democrat who spent more than 40 years in Congress, has died of a massive heart attack. President Reagan has called an emergency meeting of his national security advisors to decide just how to respond to the apparent Soviet attack on a Korean Airlines jumbo jet. And members of Congress have reacted with outrage to words of the incident and the death of Georgia Representative Larry McDonald on the airplane. Details of these stories and the rest of the news just ahead. Also this morning on Night Watch, why would a Soviet fighter attack an unarmed civilian airliner? We'll look into this mystery with Congressman Denny Smith, a former airline and combat fighter pilot. What's ahead for Israel? A report on the man chosen to succeed Menachem Begin.
Good morning, I'm Chris Glenn. The man the Senate called Scoop is dead. Washington Democrat Henry Jackson died of a heart attack on Thursday night. President Reagan is cutting short his vacation and returning to Washington today for a special meeting of his National Security Council at issue how to respond to the reported Soviet attack on a South Korean jumbo jet. Deborah Potter has our report.
I want to speculate beyond that now.
Administration officials who informed President Reagan that the plane had been shot down described him as angry and deeply disturbed. White House spokesman Larry Speaks said the incident seemed incredible and demanded a full accounting.
There are no circumstances that can justify the unprecedented attack on an unarmed civilian aircraft. The Soviet Union owes an explanation to the world about how and why this tragedy has occurred.
At the time, officials said there were no plans for the president to cut short his vacation, and he went for his regular horseback ride on his mountaintop ranch. Aides said that anything he could do at the White House, he could do there.
The president is keeping in touch with it and has been providing direction all morning from this location.
When the Soviets finally put out their version of the incident, the United States called it unacceptable. As reported by TASS, an unidentified plane violated Soviet airspace twice and fighters were scrambled, but there was no mention of any shots. The reaction in Santa Barbara was a toughly worded statement from the president describing the Soviet actions as utter barbarity.
Words can scarcely express our revulsion at this horrifying act of violence. The United States joins with other members of the international community in demanding a full explanation for this appalling and wanton misdeed. The Soviet statements to this moment have totally failed to explain how or why this tragedy has occurred.
Officials here began to worry that given the circumstances, it wouldn't have looked right for the president to stay on his ranch. So he's returning to Washington later today for an urgent meeting with his national security advisors. On the agenda, options for action to protest the incident. Sources say there's almost no chance of strong sanctions. Canceling the grain agreement the U.S. just signed is seen as extremely unlikely. But relations are badly strained, and there is concern that the incident could have repercussions in the critical area of arms control. Deborah Potter, CBS News, Santa Barbara.